Today on the Africa Policy Chat, we'll be speaking with Claude Grunitzky. He's best known as the founder and editor-in-chief of the lifestyle publication Trace, an international fashion and music title, and as co-founder of the Trace TV network. He runs the Equity Alliance, an investment fund focused on diverse venture capital fund managers and entrepreneurs. True, a content marketing agency, and True Africa, a media platform championing young African voices. He will share insights on his entrepreneurship journey and perspectives on elevating African voices in the media. Enjoy the conversation. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us today, Claude. It's really exciting to hear about the work that you're doing and to learn a little bit about your insights and perspectives when it comes to the African landscape, especially in media and entertainment. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Great.
It's such an honor to be part of the Policy Journal team again.
Awesome. Yes, I was really excited to hear that you were on the board. Like, I was like, yes, this is incredible.
Yeah. So I feel very much at home.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to actually just quickly start by asking you a little bit about growing up. I know that you're from Togo. And I wanted to learn a little bit about what your childhood was like, and specifically in your mind, like what are some of the values that you grew up with that you feel helped you in the journey that you ended up going on as an entrepreneur, as a serial entrepreneur, and as a journalist?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Ada. For me, it's always been about being humble and being hungry at the same time. And I say that because I grew up in a very unusual setting in Togo. On my father's side, there was mainly a lot of very high-powered politicians who had risen to the very top of Togolese society and politics. So my father had two uncles who had been president of Togo, the first two presidents of Togo. And my father himself was a rising star in Togolese politics. He was appointed Minister of Finance when I was very young. And he was somebody who very much wanted to help shape the destiny of this small nation. And on my mother's side, however, these were people who were a lot more humble in the sense of not having any sort of real formal education, having to really struggle, live hand to mouth. It was really kind of difficult. And I was constantly navigating both of those worlds, constantly. And then what happened was my father, he was named ambassador of Togo to Washington, which is the most prestigious post. And then the president of Togo just fired him one day, maybe fearing that he had political ambitions of his own. And overnight, my dad became a pariah and he became a quote unquote nobody in Togolese society because he was forced into early retirement. And that is something that I witnessed as a child, this rise and fall. And at the same time, it gave me this ability to understand that certain people are just fair weather friends. And when things are going well for you politically, they'll be around and then they disappear just overnight. So I ended up valuing friendship and authenticity and solidarity in a different way. And then the other thing that I learned growing up was the fact that I realized really early on that I was really comfortable around powerful people and also very comfortable around really poor people. And that ability to navigate multiple worlds, the worlds of poverty and wealth, the worlds of privilege, and then destitution, that is something that I've carried with me my entire life.
Thank you so much for that. You left Togo pretty, I guess, early. You went to school in a couple of different countries. And then by the age of 24, you had launched your first magazine. And then it quickly, it changed to Trace and then quickly became a huge, success. How did you manage success coming that early in life? How are you able to balance what success brought?
Well, the reason I was able to enjoy success is because I had a lot of failure before I got to success. And when you said quickly, that's the only word that I would push back on. Mm-hmm. It was not quickly. I really struggled in the beginning when I started my media ventures. I started, with True magazine, which folded after a year because I had a really bad business breakup with my cousin, who was also my best friend. And then a year later, I launched Trace magazine, which really struggled at the beginning to just stay afloat because I was kind of funding everything out of pocket and just never having enough funding to really make sure that I could make payroll on time and make rent on time. It was a real struggle for the very first couple of years of that Trace venture. But then what happened was I got very lucky in the sense that I met Alicia Keys, the singer, and I put her on the cover of my magazine. And that was a turning point for Trace because soon after that, I got funded by Goldman Sachs, who invested $15 million in my Trace media company. And that investment really changed everything for me because not only did I have funding to really grow the magazine business, but also launch a television network, which has become really, really popular all over Africa. I also finally had to deal with real responsibilities. I had to answer to a board and having to manage a lot of employees and scaling, quite frankly. And I wasn't necessarily fully prepared for that. So I don't want to say that I immediately enjoyed my success. It took a few years before I could kind of ease into the role of somebody who was actually going to be successful because I always felt that the rug could be swept from under my feet. And that was because I struggled so much in the beginning that I kind of felt that, you know what, this whole thing could be over very, very quickly in the way that I saw the fall of my own father, who from being a very important person became a nobody overnight. You know, I always kind of felt that, yeah, this thing could end very quickly. So I never settled into a role of feeling that I was ever really successful.
Great. Now, when you look back on the work that's on Trace and that work, like you said, it's become a really popular station across the continent. When you look back on the work that you did all those years, what for you are some of the, if I would say, the legacies that you think that work has produced that you're really proud of today?
Well, in terms of Trace magazine, which was my first venture with Trace, even though we launched other ventures under the Trace brand afterwards, Trace TV and so on, I really am very proud of the work that we did around a series of magazine covers called Black Girls Rule. And Black Girls Rule is an annual issue of Trace magazine that I started producing back in 1997. So that was 25 years ago. And I was in my early 20s at the time and just really trying to find a way to represent the resilience and the beauty and the creativity of Black women around the world, starting with African women, but also Black women in the Caribbean and in Europe and in America and so on. And that became a bit of a calling card for Trace. And I'm really proud of the fact that to this day, people still ask me about what we were able to do by showcasing the beauty and creativity of Black women, but also using hip hop as a driving force for that publication, for that movement, where we were able to integrate music and film and art and technology and fashion into a narrative that was about how do we help with the advancement of Black people globally. You know, it wasn't just about, Black people in America or Black people in Africa. I was always looking at it almost like Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican Black Pan-Africanist did, was very much about how do we unite Black people globally around these shared affinities. But I also looked at it from a transcultural perspective because I also wanted non-Black people to relate to our culture and to appreciate our culture for what it was worth. So I feel like the Black Girls Rule movement was very much the embodiment of that spirit of transculturalism, because we're starting from a Black perspective, but we're making it relevant to a lot of people who are not Black and don't necessarily know about the Black experience in that way.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on that. In your work, in the years that you worked both in Trace and your other ventures, did you feel the tension of sort of being Black or being African in the world that you were in? Was it something that was a constant reminder to you, or did you think that you were able to, blending in the industry and culture that you were working in?
I feel like for me, I was always blending in because I had different hybrid identities, which I kind of brought to the fore. So I always make sure that I was very proud of my Togolese identity, but I'm also a French citizen. So I was very much rooted in French culture in some ways. And I also became an American citizen. So I was very much attached to certain values that are attached to America. But the reality, though, is I always felt like an outsider. Even though I was blending in, I was always the outsider looking in, because I was always a serial immigrant. And so when you can't easily answer the question, where are you from? It becomes a little bit more complicated. So I usually say that I'm from Togo, but that is just giving part of the answer, because I grew up in Togo, but I also grew up in Paris, and I grew up in London, and I've been living in New York, and I've traveled around the world, and I have a house in Brazil, and I've reported from everywhere. So in that sense, because transculturalism became the defining philosophy of my media ventures, I started claiming this Black identity that I carried everywhere and that defined who I was as the starting point. But I was always exploring different viewpoints from a cosmopolitan perspective. And I think that allowed me to have a more powerful voice in that sense, because I can understand so many different sensibilities from around the world.
Now, in 2015, you pivoted, or you established True Africa, which is basically elevating African voices, especially people who are doing excellent work in Africa. Talk to me a little bit about what was going on in your mind at the time that made you think that it was time to focus specifically on a product that looked at people and the work they were doing on the continent.
So after I sold Trace in 2010, I took a couple years off to really reflect on what I wanted to do next in the media space, specifically looking at the digital media space. And that's a time when I was traveling to Africa more and more, doing a lot of work with Barack Obama's Young African Leaders Initiative, which is called YALI, setting up my own young entrepreneurs program in Togo, and working all over the continent. And I realized that a lot of the stories that I was reading, that everyone was reading about Africa, were very much from a foreign perspective. They were written with a European lens or an American lens or a Chinese lens. And I didn't feel like there were enough actual real native sons of Africa like myself, or native daughters of Africa, who were writing the African stories and who were bringing a fresh lens to how Africa was changing and how young Africans were reinventing themselves through technology and through usage of the internet and social media and everything that was actually becoming really powerful at the time. And I figured, you know what, let me just start a digital media company called True Africa, that it will be exclusively focused on championing young African voices all over the world. So I was always focused on what was happening on the continent, but I also, once again, went back to my original vision, which is a vision I borrowed from Marcus Garvey, to look at, what are the most interesting things happening in the world of Afro descendants in Brazil, in Jamaica, in Haiti, in the US, in Paris, and London. And that is the reason that I created True Africa, which thankfully was funded by Google and has been publishing digitally since 2015. So for the past 7 years.
Awesome. What kind of responses have you gotten to the work that you're doing in True Africa? I mean, do you think that you've gotten responses that are encouraging, or have there been any challenges?
There's been a lot of challenges. What happened was, to be honest, when I started True Africa in 2015, we were off to a great start, and we quickly built up a readership of around 300,000 people, which is pretty substantial for a new online publication. And I was kind of feeling that could also be very successful in the way that Trace became successful. But then what happened was, in around 2017, Facebook changed their algorithm, and they deprioritized the news. And when I say they changed their algorithm, a lot of people know that they changed their algorithm as a result of a lot of the fake news that was published on Facebook ahead of the 2016 presidential election in America, and also in other parts of the world. And so I had pretty much hung my hat on Facebook, in the sense that a lot of our traffic and readers were coming from Facebook. People who were searching Africa, a lot of them were coming directly to our site via Facebook. And when we were less visible on Facebook, our audience decreased. And I had to find a way to reinvent the True Africa brand, because I could tell that the business model that I had perfected, which was around securing advertising, through an important and influential readership, that was going to be a very challenging model to really establish. And so I started thinking of how could I actually be really, truly useful to African youth and to promote African voices. And that's when I pivoted to the True Africa University model, which is piggybacking on the True Africa Media platform. And we are launching an online learning platform for African youth and partnership with MIT. And to me, that's very important because it is the evolution and the pivot that will hopefully turn it into a really sustainable venture that will be truly useful for African youth.
That's excellent. That's really exciting. In the work that you've done in Africa, what would you say are some of the things that, some of the successes, that you see in the African either media and entertainment entrepreneurship space that can be examples, can be emulated by others?
Some of the successes?
Yes, that you see on the continent in terms of what people are doing in their countries, what people are doing in their work, that you think are worthy of emulation.
Yes, I believe that what's happening now is the transformation that's being facilitated by connectivity and internet access is something that is really interesting. So I find that a lot of young Africans are very creative in the way that they leverage the power of the internet to launch creative industries that are new, that may be nascent, but they're actually driven by a real critical force, which is around films that are being released all over Africa, not just Nollywood, but also in Ghana and other countries, and Senegal and South Africa, Kenya, films that are truly made in Africa and that tell African stories and that are finding their ways to streaming platforms such as Netflix. Netflix alone is 75% of all the streaming audience in Africa. And so they've become more and more interested in understanding these local productions and finding a way to distribute them to the world, really. And that really is great because it allows people to get a perspective of Africa and African mindsets and African behaviors and African lifestyles that are homegrown and that are truly, as I said, made in Africa versus foreign people coming in and just thinking that they can just come in for 3 weeks and report on Africa and go back home and tell the definitive African story.
Okay. Last year, you launched another initiative, which is the Equity Alliance Fund to provide venture capital for entrepreneurs. Can you talk to me a little bit about your vision for this fund and who it's meant to serve?
For me, the Equity Alliance is almost like a culmination of the work that I've been doing in my entire adult life around promoting and supporting young Black people, women, people of color who had a vision. Some of them actually became entrepreneurs. And it was the result of a friendship and a relationship and a mentorship that I developed over a 15-year period with Dick Parsons. I put the link there to the Wall Street Journal article. Well, Dick Parsons was the CEO of Time Warner back when it was the world's largest media company. That's when I met him. That time I was still running Trace. And I looked up to him because he was the quote unquote most important person in media globally because it was the world's largest media company. And I always talked to him about various things related to media, related to Africa, related to entrepreneurship. And we developed a friendship. And about a year ago, he called me, said, this George Floyd moment and Black Lives Matter and what's happening, with gender movements and everything, we really should do something together. And he came up with the idea that we should work together to launch a fund called the Equity Alliance to invest exclusively in venture capital firms and early stage ventures that are run by women and people of color. So we've made 15 investments. We just raised 28.6 million, and we're going to raise $100 million fund later on this year to put that money to work in entrepreneurial communities that are usually underserved and people who have a hard time accessing capital. So I feel like that is really part of Dick's legacy and part of my legacy, because this is going to sustain businesses all over for a long time. And it's not just reporting and telling great stories. That's a part of it, but this is actually investing in order to build generational wealth.
Awesome. I'm glad you talked about investment because many young people have left the continent like you did and are interested in giving back and in starting ventures back home. talk to me a little bit about the policy space. What do you think that governments can do, or in countries across the continent, to support entrepreneurs who are, trying to invest, trying to build businesses on the continent?
I think it's a great question. I'm glad you asked me that question, because what I found was that a lot of very successful Africans did not support the next generation in the way that they should. A lot of very high net worth Africans, when I approached them for funding for True Africa, even actually going back to my Trace days, when I approached them for funding for Trace, they all rejected me, and they'd rather spend their money buying apartments on Bond Street in London or on Avenue Montaigne in Paris than actually investing in the future of Africa. So I was very disappointed with a lot of very rich Africans not supporting the next generation through investment. But things are changing now, and the reason I'm hopeful is because there are a few African startups that have become very significant. A couple of them have become unicorns, meaning they're worth more than $1 billion in value. And the reality is now, all of a sudden, certain Africans are waking up to the fact that we need to invest in businesses, we need to invest in young talent, we need to invest in young innovation that is coming out of Africa, and it's starting to change. And there's wonderful initiatives like Tonu Elumelu in Nigeria. I'm pretty sure about his $100 million commitment to fund 10,000 young African businesses. So we need more initiatives like that if we're going to actually start competing on the global stage. And I want to be a part of that in the way that I have been through media and investment. I want to be a leader in that space that is all about putting money where your mouth is.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to let you go, but I just wanted to ask you to share a piece of advice or a proverb, something that you hold dear that either maybe your mom or your dad shared with you, or something that is an advice that you hold dear. And if you want to share it in your language, you're free to.
Let me think about this. I read the question, but I didn't actually think about this. And it's just, I'll say it in English. It might be easier, because this is something that that my dad used to say. And my dad was very much like me, an optimist. He was very much always a positive person, even when things were really tough for him. I told you about his fall from grace and all that. And he always used to say to me, there's no problems, there's only solutions. And that is something that I've always carried with me my whole life.
Awesome. Claude Grunitzky, thank you so much for your time for speaking with us today at the Africa Policy Journal. It's been a pleasure.